Very good to be here speaking with folks this morning. Let me first get a show of hands for how many of you believe that cybersecurity is is a topic of discussion at least once a year in your board of your company. Okay, that's most people. How about quarterly? Still a lot of hands. That's really good to hear. I won't belabor this point, but you have a nice handout at your table talking about cybersecurity risk management. Hits a lot of points that I think are really valuable. One of the points that I keep hearing as I talk to my colleagues as chief information security officers and as I speak to boards and CEOs is that most boards are coalescing a little bit around, at least for now, a tempo of quarterly audit meetings on cybersecurity and then full board meetings at least once a year. So this is absolutely a hot topic in the boardroom and throughout companies. And I think you see that today, in fact, as we look at today's program. I want to talk to you a little bit today about the threat and what DHS does, and then actually mention briefly the current legislative conversation, because we're having this meeting is happening in a very dynamic moment right now for cybersecurity legislation. So first, what does my organization at DHS do? We've got 3 customers, and you are one of those 3 customers: private sector, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and the federal civilian government. And with all of those customers, our job is to help them manage their cyber risks. That's it. I'm not law enforcement, I'm not intelligence, I'm not a regulator. My only job is to make you more effective at securing your cybersecurity risks. And we do that through 3 different avenues. And really, when I spend a lot of time now, I've been in cybersecurity since 1998. And in 1998, 1999, the idea was we have to raise awareness, and we talked a lot to chief information officers. And we were really pushing this idea of create a chief information security officer. Well, I think we won that battle. And now the conversation is really with the boards of directors and the CEOs. And they say, okay, I got it. The message is loud and clear. I have to care about cybersecurity. Now, what do you want me to do about it? I care. What's the next step? And so usually I break it down. I say, look, I need you to spend your attention on 3 things: best practices, information sharing, and incident response. If you bucket your attention in those 3 areas, you'll make huge progress. Best practices should probably be about 80% of your attention. You're not going to read about it in the newspaper. The Congress doesn't have any legislative conversation around best practices right now, but the big bang for your buck in managing your risk is to just do the practices that we have known about for 20 years. Will add enormous security to your company. They are tedious. You have to do them consistently and at scale, and they will cost you money. But they add a lot of security value. But they are not sufficient, because you're dealing with an adversary who is changing their behavior. So you also have to share information. You have to know, what are the bad guys doing to your peers, to other companies? What's motivating them? And you also have to share the tactical information. Be on the lookout for this IP address. It's a malicious computer. Don't let it talk to your network. And that should be about 15% of your time. About 80%, I would focus on best practices. This, by the way, is a total rule of thumb. There's no science here. 80% best practices, 15% information sharing. And then as an executive, the last 5% of your time should be spent making sure you're prepared for incidents. You can argue with these numbers. You can adjust them one way or another, but you get the rough idea of the balance. Okay, so what are we doing all this for? We know that we have to focus on best practices, that we have to share information, and we have to be able to respond to incidents. Why? Who are the bad guys? And how do you think about the bad guys? I've stolen a little bit from FBI Director Comey and taken an idea of his and tweaked it some. And so I think somebody just said I shouldn't be stealing from the FBI director. That's the kind of thing that'll really come back and haunt you. Fair. Somebody else stole from the FBI director, and I heard about it. Bucket the threats into 5 categories: vandals, burglars, muggers, spies, and saboteurs. So vandals. These are the groups, think of anonymous, Think about web protests. These are the groups that want to take down your website, that maybe want to replace it with a protest message. It's not obviously pleasant. It has some reputation risk, but there's a limit to the amount of disruption that comes from this type of vandalism. And the good news is, largely, they telegraph their intentions. If one of these groups is mad at you, you're usually on the front page of a newspaper for doing something that they will find upsetting, or they're talking about it in chat rooms in a way that you or an intelligence company you hire on your behalf is going to find out about it. So that's the vandals. Burglars. You have something of value, they want to take it. I mean, that's fairly simple. I think we all know how that works. I won't belabor the point. It may be personal information that they want to steal from you. It may be they want to break into your systems and do wire transfers if you're a bank or a small business. But the motivation is financial, and crime has been crime for millennia, and it's not going to change. Muggers. Think about the attack on Sony. The attack on Sony was done really to make a point, and was, you could argue more metaphorically violent than it needed to be. And certainly, obviously shouldn't have been an attack in the first place. So a mugger is out to get you. They may want something from you, but they're not going to be silent or polite about it. This is obviously a real risk. This can be incredibly disruptive. The goal here is to cause damage to further a goal. Spies. Spies are not just after military and government secrets, they're after your intellectual property. And you would be surprised how valuable other people might find your intellectual property, even if you don't think about it as particularly unique. You've been in business for a long time, you know how to manufacture your widget or you name it. You have well thought out processes in place. Somebody may just want to copy your processes. So don't underestimate your attractiveness as a target to spies. And then finally, saboteurs. Saboteurs are one of my greatest areas of concern because they the goal is to lurk in our infrastructure and at a time of national crisis, disrupt our private sector critical infrastructure. That's obviously a huge risk to our nation. The good news is, with respect to saboteurs, our traditional deterrence mechanisms work, right? So breaking into our infrastructure and severely disrupting it is the kind of thing that nations respond vigorously to, and people generally don't want to provoke a vigorous reaction from the United States. So that's how I've been thinking about the threats, and I encourage you to think about them that way too. An interesting lens that reveals is that vandals, burglars, and muggers, there's a very rapid feedback loop. You're going to know when a vandal, a burglar, or a mugger has done something to you. A vandal or a mugger, it causes damage, you feel the pain immediately. A burglar, they steal something, at a certain point they're going to monetize it. They're going to sell the personal information, and you're going to find out about it then. So the good news, if there is one, on that is you're going to learn how good your security is against those three threats. The bad news on spies and saboteurs is there's not a rapid feedback loop. The whole point is to not get caught. And so you do not necessarily get feedback as to whether you are the target of a spy or whether you have a saboteur lurking in your infrastructure. That's a cause for concern for me, and it should be a cause for concern for you. There's not a great solution to that other than you have to be actively looking in your networks to see if bad guys are there. Let me speak briefly on the legislation that is currently up for consideration in the Senate. So folks are tracking the legislation, I hope, that you're cognizant at least that there's some legislation being discussed. No hands are being raised. You're either shy, you're asleep, or the Congress, you've just given up. All right. So for about 4.5, 5 years, we have been talking about passing information sharing legislation. Why? Why do we need to do that? The idea is that we are all better protected if you in the private sector feel comfortable sharing with us in government what you're seeing, the types of intrusions or attempted intrusions, for example, that are happening on your network. And the idea here is the very tactical information that helps us all protect ourselves. So you're not sharing the fact, hey, I had a breach and it really cost me a lot of damage. That's not the type of information sharing we're talking about. What we're talking about are threat indicators. Literally, it's the equivalent of a be on the lookout. Be on the lookout for a car with this license plate. It's a burglar. Be on the lookout for a 6'5" guy with sandy hair and dark glasses, because he's great. That's the type of information that we're talking about sharing here. It's the IP addresses of computers. It's the sending email address of a phishing email. This is the kind of information that companies can use to protect themselves against threats. And most of the time, you learn this information not because you've been breached, but just because you're going about your daily business of defending yourselves. You've caught something malicious. You want to share it so that everybody's protected. Think about you're trying to inoculate all the other potential victims against an attack. That's the goal of the legislation. Now, we see 3 risks with respect to this legislation that we need to address to make it successful. Actually, I would add a 4th risk. The 4th risk is it has to be effective, right? It has to give companies comfort that they can share information and not be held liable. I'll tell you, for the most part, if there's a company that wants to share information with part of the government, we find a way to make it happen. I have great lawyers. They talk to a company's lawyers. They hold their hands. They tell them about all the different nuances, and they get them to a place of comfort. The problem is, I can't do that for every company in America. We need to make it a clear regime so that general counsels understand this, and they don't have to be walked through it every time that it's okay to share with the government. And so the 4th risk is, we have to do this in a way that makes it effective, that gives companies the comfort that they can share. The other 3 risks are about how we do this. We need to do this in a way that the government gets all the information and can assemble it so that we can connect the dots, so that we can say, all right, this threat indicator was seen in an energy company, but it was also seen in a financial services company. This threat is clearly going broadly across the U.S. economy. Or there's a threat that's focused solely on water utilities, so we really need to raise their awareness about that threat. We need to have that lens so that we can connect the dots and have some understanding of what's happening across the U.S. And the solution for that is the administration has advocated that there be a single portal by which all this information comes into the government. At DHS, that is my organization, and then it's my job to share that information rapidly and effectively with other government agencies so that they can act on it as necessary. And we've built the system to do that. It goes live in 9 days. So we are ready for this legislation to pass. I suspect that we'll be faster than the legislation, in fact. Second risk is the liability that we're talking about is liability imposed by privacy protections. So one company's liability is one individual's privacy protection. And so we need to do this in a way that individuals in America are confident in that they still have appropriate privacy protections, and that they do, in fact, still have appropriate privacy protections. And the other risk I wanted to highlight, I've got my numbers all wrong at this point, I'll throw them out. The other risk I want to highlight is corporate reputation risk. It's a tough time to be an American business working abroad. And it doesn't help our companies if they are perceived as being inappropriately collaborating with the American government and foreign nations. And so we need to do this in a way that is transparent to other countries and that they are confident that this is being done in an appropriate way. Now, the good news is, on the Senate bill that's currently up for consideration, I think we've made very good progress. We've still got a ways to go, but we're getting there. So I see a positive trajectory. That bill has been under discussion the last 2 days, and we'll probably, now I'm no expert on Senate rules and procedures, probably we'll have resolution on this early to middle of next week. So this really is a crux time. The House has already passed a bill, or 2 bills kind of cobbled together, and so if the Senate passes a bill, ultimately, we've got a path forward to making this happen. So it is a very interesting time on the cybersecurity legislation front. So those are the thoughts I want to leave you with as we start the day off. Know that as a company, you need to be looking at best practices, information sharing, and the ability to respond to incidents. we at DHS and other parts of the government are very ready and willing to help you. One thing I did notice about the paper is it suggested companies should become partners with the governments in countries where they work, and it listed all these governments but not the US. So hopefully it just went without saying, we have programs to help companies be more secure, very robust public-private partnerships. I ask you to be cognizant and worried about vandals, burglars, muggers, spies, and saboteurs. And then finally, we have legislation right now that I think if we make a few fixes to it can get us to a place where we have made progress as a country. So I am cautiously optimistic this morning. I hope you are too. I don't know that the rest of the presentations today will leave you with optimism. They might just leave you worried. So start the day at least with cautious optimism, and I look forward to further conversations today. Thank you.